Happy Thursday, History 340. Back in the saddle. Wait, it's not Thursday, it's Wednesday. Oh, coronavirus days. So happy Wednesday, History 340. I hope you're all well. It's week 13 of our semester. And the topic for this week is the Civil War and the transformation of the nation. Now, as you know, we've been discussing the Civil War now this will be the third week, but for the previous 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, we discussed the constitutional crisis of secession. Last week, we discussed the beginning of the war, the First and Second Confiscation Acts. And so I want to build on those two discussions today and talk about the end of the Civil War and how the nation transformed. And the biggest transformation that happened as a result of the Civil War was, in fact, the abolition of slavery, the emancipation of slaves. And so that'll be the main theme for today. Although I also want to touch on a couple of topics that are discussed in Benedict, the Blessings of Liberty, about, in general, the expansion of power during wartime, in this case, the Civil War. But before I get into that, just a couple of things. First of all, you should have access to your midterm grades. Those are posted on Blackboard under the Grade Center. If you can't see your grade for some reason, let me know, and I will let you know what your grade is. If you want more feedback on your exam, please just email me, and I'll be happy to give it. But I just wanted you to get your grades back as soon as possible. So before getting into the topic for today, just a reminder that as we're looking at the end of the semester, it's somewhat close. We still have 1, 2, 3 full weeks after this week before the final exam. For the next few weeks, we're going to be doing sort of regular video and then discussion board post chats. For this week, since as I mentioned in an email, I had some technical difficulties on Monday, posting this video on Wednesday, because it is Wednesday. I'm going to put up a discussion board post for you all tomorrow, which is Thursday. Then you'll have until the end of the weekend to post a response to it. So you'll have 4 days, 4 days to do it. Next week we'll be, again, back on a normal schedule. And I guess by way of getting into the topic for today, I want to just talk a little bit about your responses to the discussion post last week. I'm a little surprised and interested in how many of you, and here I'm looking at them now, made the point that slavery and the idea of emancipating slaves was not a priority from the beginning of the Civil War. Because in many ways, I think it was a priority of Abraham Lincoln. Those First and Second Confiscation Acts that we talked about were not full-scale statements of emancipation, but as I said last week, stepping stones that ultimately would result in a full-scale emancipation policy. And that's what really the theme is for today. And I think one of the reasons why there is, so many of you said that the war was not a war of emancipation, at least at the beginning of the war, is because that's the standard narrative. It's also one that's repeated, frankly, in the textbook, Benedict, the Blessings of Liberty. But it's one that I question only because it fails to explain why slaves were being freed from the very beginning of the war, even if the confiscation acts were two small steps: the first confiscation act in August of 1861, the second in July of 1862. Small steps that, as I said, were not a comprehensive, full-scale emancipation policy. Slaves were being emancipated from the very beginning of the war. And so that narrative that Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party were not particularly interested in attacking slavery in the first years of the war, but pivoted to it in the middle of the war, is the traditional narrative. But it's one that is, I think, really should be questioned. One of the reasons for that is the First and Second Confiscation Acts. The other reason for it is because it asks us to think about the Emancipation Proclamation in a little bit more of a different perspective, if you will. Because usually in this standard narrative that Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans did not meaningfully desire to emancipate slaves at the beginning of the war, but then decided at some point in the middle of the war to change tracks and begin making emancipation a primary goal. That interpretation always pivots on the Emancipation Proclamation. And so I think I'll just start with that now, the Emancipation Proclamation. And undoubtedly one of the, let's say, 2 or 3 most famous and significant statements in American political, military, and social history. One that we all learn about, I think, at quite young ages, at least if you've gone to middle school and high school in the United States. But one that sometimes I think is a little bit misinterpreted because it's often taken out of context from the Confiscation Acts and emancipation policy that preceded it. And so when it's put into context, it is not less significant, but it is more I think, profitably seen as a third step in an ongoing process of figuring out emancipation, but how to do so within a strictly constitutional framework, which, as I said last class, in the last video, and is also mentioned in chapter 9 of Benedict Blessings of Liberties, was a priority for Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans, that any policy they applied towards slavery and the emancipation of slaves had to be done so within a strictly legal constitutional framework. And so just for a little bit of refresher just about the chronology of the war before we get to the Emancipation Proclamation. As I mentioned in the last video, and is standard to all narratives of the progress of the Civil War, the war itself in 1861 and 1862, the first 2 years of the war, in general was tilting towards the favor of the Confederacy, militarily, that is, that the Confederacy had the upper hand through winning several decisive battles early in the war. That was compounded by the fact that the string of major generals that Abraham Lincoln appointed at the beginning of the war were in general ineffective. So that, combined with Confederate military victories, the tide of the war shifted early in favor towards the Confederacy. That began to change by the end of 1862. And so in the fall of 1862 is when we see the first inklings of the Emancipation Proclamation. And it was on September 22nd, 1862, Abraham Lincoln made a provisional announcement about an Emancipation Proclamation. And this provisional announcement is often left out of the narrative, or more traditional standard narratives of slavery and the Civil War, because it foreshadows what would come over the next several years. And it again puts into context where the Emancipation Proclamation itself sits in a longer story of emancipation policy. So on September the 22nd of 1862, Abraham Lincoln released a statement. He did so to newspapers. And so this was widely reprinted throughout the Union, and it was reprinted in Confederate newspapers as well. And it was basically an ultimatum, is the way that I like to think about it. And to paraphrase it, it said, in brief, that if the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America, do not cease to fight the Union, do not cease their rebellion, and agree to come back into the Union or to start a peace process, at the very least, that within 100 days, or after, I should say, 100 days, the Union Army would enact a policy of freeing all slaves resident in Confederate states, those states which had seceded from the United States to join the Confederacy. Here I just want to remind us, and I mentioned this last class, that not all of the slave states in the United States before the Civil War, in fact, joined the Confederacy. Four, most notably, did not. The so-called border states, slave states, which bordered free states of the North. And those were Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. So this provisional Emancipation Proclamation, and in fact the Emancipation Proclamation, did not include those border states. And so this provisional Emancipation Proclamation, as I said, was functioning ultimatum, to put it bluntly. Lincoln told the Confederacy through this statement, if they don't stop fighting and agree to begin a peace process, that after 100 days, which so happened to be January the 1st of 1863, so beginning the first day of the next year, my armies, the Union armies, when they invade Confederate territory, when they invade Confederate states, they will free slaves, and they will do so regardless of the caveats that existed in the first two confiscation acts. They would have a blanket emancipation policy for any slave in any Confederate state, regardless of who owned them and regardless of what they had been used for. So if you remember, the first confiscation act was limited to freeing slaves who it could be proven had been forced to support the Confederate war movement. The second confiscation act broadened that out and emancipated, that's the word, any slave who was owned by a Confederate sympathizer, anybody in sympathy with the Confederacy, slaves that they owned would be freed. So the third, in many ways, the Provisional Emancipation Proclamation and the Emancipation Proclamation itself were the third confiscation act. If we can see a stepping stone of a narrow definition of who could be freed to a broader one, to finally with the Emancipation Proclamation, a very broad emancipation policy. To me, the Emancipation Proclamation isn't some aha pivot point that came out of nowhere, but more a logical extension of previous emancipation laws. Why did Abraham Lincoln do this? As I mentioned, do it this way in order to make sure that his and congressional Republicans' policies fell squarely within the authority that they had under the Constitution of the United States, so that they're still recognizing the Constitution. So what did the Emancipation Proclamation decree? And if you have your link up to it, please scroll to it. If you don't, the Emancipation Proclamation is posted on Blackboard under the Content tab. So if you don't have it up, just go ahead and pause this for a second and go ahead and pull it up. If you do have it up, or if you've paused and now have it up, I just want to point to a couple of points here that I think are of particular relevance. And so this transcription from archives.gov, the National Archives, United States National Archives, is the full Emancipation Proclamation statement. And as you can see, it's quite short. The very first line refers to this Provisional Emancipation Proclamation, saying, just to paraphrase that, whereas last September 22nd, Abraham Lincoln said this, that on the first day of January in the year of our Lord 1863, here's the key point, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then forever free. So that's two words that I really want to emphasize here. And I'm reading that, by the way, from the second paragraph of the Emancipation Proclamation. So there's a declaration that we are declaring forever free all slaves within any state that is in rebellion against the United States. So as I pointed out last week, that language, forever free, does appear in the Second Confiscation Act, but that Second Confiscation Act only applied to Confederate sympathizers. This applies to any slave, again, in any of the Confederate states. Not to be very clear, and this is where there's some confusion about the Emancipation Proclamation, not to enslaved people living in the so-called border states, the slave states that did not join the Confederacy. So the Emancipation Proclamation, while it seems on its face like a super broad declaration of emancipation, only applied to the Confederate states. So that's one point that I want to make. Why? Because the border states were not then in rebellion against the Union. They had not joined the Confederacy. And as we scroll down, one of the things that I'll just want to point out that really gives you a sense for exactly where this applied, if you go down to the 4, the fifth paragraph, beginning with the word Arkansas, is a list of all of the states and territories that this applied to. Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, 3 Confederate states, with the exception of some parishes in Louisiana. I'm not going to read the whole list off, but including the city of New Orleans. Why? Because by that point, by January 1st, 1863, the Union Army had actually invaded and conquered those portions of Louisiana. So territories in the Confederate state of Louisiana that had been, I said conquered, but occupied by the Union Army were exempted from this. You might ask yourself, why? That's because in those areas, slaves had already been freed because the Union Army had occupied them. And then it continues Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, etc., all Confederate states, excepting portions of Confederate states that had already been occupied by the Union. So if one wants to know exactly where the Emancipation Proclamation applied to, Abraham Lincoln thankfully gave us a complete list of all of those places. And as we continue further down the Emancipation Proclamation, we see a couple of injunctions that Abraham Lincoln makes to people who might become free as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation, hereby enjoining upon these people, so declared to be free, to abstain in all violence unless in necessary self-defense. And I recommend to them that in all cases when allowed, they labor fruitfully for reasonable wages. So he's encouraging freed people who would be freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, to not engage in violence against former slaveholders in particular, but other Southern whites, and if possible to work for wages. So we're seeing here the destruction of the system of slavery as a labor system already in the Emancipation Proclamation, right? It's a key question that we're going to encounter actually next week, but I want to get us thinking about it now, is what impact did emancipation have on freed people who were freed as a result ultimately of the Civil War. And before moving along and past our discussion of the Emancipation Proclamation, I want to make one point very clear, and it's worth thinking about for a moment, because it'll help us also understand later events that we're going to talk about, that I'll talk about in this video. It's that the Emancipation Proclamation is a broad statement declaring slaves forever free who resided in the Confederate States, minus the portions of those states that were already occupied by the Union. So on one level, this is a major and certainly extremely significant statement declaring the freedom of 4 million enslaved people, the slave population of the Confederacy. On the other hand, on a practical level, it did not free 4 million people immediately. Why? Because the practical matter was that the Emancipation Proclamation was only able to be implemented, meaning that slaves were only able to be emancipated in parts of the Confederacy where the Union Army already had, or in the next 2 years would occupy. So that in large parts of the Confederacy, but especially the interior parts of states like Alabama and Mississippi and northern Louisiana, for example, the kind of interior heartland of the Confederacy, no slaves were actually freed as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. Why? The Union Army simply did not invade that far into the interior of the Confederate States. So the Emancipation Proclamation was only forceful where the Union Army was able to invade Confederate territory. And it had no effect at all on the status of enslaved people in the border states. So one way to sort of put a number on that and to show us I think the limitations of the Emancipation Proclamation is to note this: that by the end of the Civil War, which officially ended in April of 1865, the best estimates that we don't have a full number, a full exact number, because of a lack of record keeping. The best guess, excuse me. The best estimates are that about 850,000 enslaved people gained their freedom directly because of the Emancipation Proclamation. Another way of restating that is that about 850,000 of 4 million, so less than 1/4, enslaved people gained freedom by being swept up into the Union Army as it slowly encroached upon Confederate territory. So that's a pretty, I think, low number, especially considering the way in which people tend to think about the Emancipation Proclamation as being a grand statement of the emancipation of slaves, the abolition of slavery everywhere in the Confederacy. The practical fact is that only about 20% of the Confederate slave population was directly freed as a result of the war. Another way of saying that is that 80% of the enslaved population in the Confederacy, as well as the enslaved population of the border states, technically at the end of the military end of the Civil War, remained enslaved, which was a major constitutional and legal and social and political problem that Abraham Lincoln was already aware of before the war even ended. And we're going to see evidence of this in the second primary source document that I asked us to read, the shortest inaugural address up until that point in American history, Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. So before I get to that and wrap up this video lecture, just a little bit more about the latter years of the war, the military aspects of the war after the Emancipation Proclamation was implemented, meaning after January the 1st, 1863. And I want to touch on some of the other some of the topics that not directly related to emancipation that are discussed in Benedict, Blessings of Liberty, chapter 9. And so militarily, what began to happen over the first half of the year 1863 is that we're starting to slowly see the Union Army gain the upper hand militarily, changing the tides of the war, which favored the Confederacy early on, to the Union slowly gaining the upper hand. And that was for the primary reason that the Union Army and the Union states in general, the free states of the North and the border states which remain in the Union, had significant objective advantages. They had a much larger population, so a much larger base from which to draw soldiers. The Union had a massive advantage in industrial capacity, the ability to use industry to produce war material, but goods needed to fight wars, guns, bullets, cannons, but also uniforms, boots, all of the different items that are needed to equip an army. The Union also had a massive financial advantage. It was able to finance the war much more easily than the Confederacy ultimately could. So these objective advantages began to pile up in the Union's favor over time. In 1863 and 1864, the war grew increasingly violent and bloody. The casualties for both sides really began to stack up. And as the war intensified, as Benedict points out in pages 187 and 188, one of the things we see the Lincoln administration and with support of the Republican Party do is begin to restrict civil liberties, or as he calls it, civil rights, as a response to wartime exigencies, wartime emergencies. So this is a pattern that I mentioned 2 weeks ago, I believe, but it's one worth just sort of reiterating here, that when we're looking at the Civil War from the perspective of constitutional rights of American citizens, we see a pattern that would continue to repeat itself in subsequent wars. Here I'm thinking most importantly of World War I in the early 20th century, and then World War II, of course, in the 1940s, which is that in times of war, when there are large-scale mobilizations of American people, civil rights tend to be rolled back on a temporary basis under the war powers clauses of the Constitution. And it's, again, a pattern that we see repeat on page 188, for example. You can note a major instance of the rollback of civil rights that was implemented by Abraham Lincoln And here I'm looking at the second full paragraph, which is that Abraham Lincoln, with the backing of a Republican-held Congress, suspended the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus throughout the country. So, quoting Michael S. Benedict, as a result, authorities could arrest and hold suspected offenders, meaning people who refused to be drafted, conscripted into the Union Army, without a trial. Right? The principle of habeas corpus is that a government cannot arrest and indefinitely detain a person unless they are officially accused, of a crime, and are provided a hasty trial. These are constitutional principles that go back to the Bill of Rights, which we talked about. It seems like another lifetime ago, but 2 months ago. If we're looking outside of the area of emancipation, we see Abraham Lincoln use a tremendous or promote a tremendous expansion of executive power to curtail rights that in peacetime are held sacredly by United States citizens. The right to habeas corpus is the most significant one. So with those notes being noted, to be redundant, I want to now return to the story of emancipation. And just to note that by the year 1864, there was war weariness on both sides. As Michael S. Benedict notes, there was a movement against the war amongst Democrats in the Union states, angered by the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, for example, angered by what they viewed Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans' ultimate goal for the war was, which was to emancipate slaves. So Lincoln's opponents in the North recognized that his goal was emancipation. It's a goal they recognized from the very beginning. And 1864, as it progressed, we see a greater tide turning in favor of the Union, but war weariness, as well as a general malaise in the northern population, led some people to think that Abraham Lincoln might not win re-election in November of 1864. So even during a time of war, the normal electoral process continued. Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860 and therefore ran for re-election in 1864. A momentous presidential election because the election would determine the outcome of the Civil War. Not necessarily if the Union would win or not. By November of 1864, it seemed clear that the Union had an insurmountable military advantage, but rather the election of 1864 would determine the fate of slavery in the United States. These were the stakes. Abraham Lincoln had made very clear that he was going to pursue a policy of total and complete emancipation of all slaves if he was reelected. His opponent for the Northern Democratic Party, named George McClellan, wanted a hasty end to the war and did not believe that the Confederate States, if they were brought back into the United States, should have emancipation imposed upon them. So there is a very, in some ways scary, but very fascinating counterfactual that had George McClellan, who started the war as a Union general, interestingly enough, before he turned on Abraham Lincoln. There's an interesting counterfactual that had George McClellan won the election of 1864, we could have had a United States in which slavery continued to remain legal, and possibly would have for at least another century, would be my guess, although that's not what happened. Abraham Lincoln was reelected, I should say, and in his second inaugural address, which was Saturday, if you can flip to it now, pause if you don't have it up, his second inaugural address, which was Saturday, March 4th, 1865, I think makes very clear that Abraham Lincoln made the emancipation of slaves and the complete abolition of slavery, or had made by that point, his primary goal for the Civil War. Another way of saying that is that Abraham Lincoln dreaded the idea that the Civil War would end, but slavery would not be fully abolished alongside the end of the war. And he makes that very clear in this inaugural address. I'm going to read from the third paragraph when he gives a little bit of a short history of why the war happened according to Abraham Lincoln. And I'll just read beginning with the first line of the third paragraph, beginning with 1/8. This really is his understanding of the Civil War and why it happened. 1/8 of the whole population of the United States before the Civil War were enslaved people, to paraphrase. Not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew, and this is a key point, all knew that slavery, this interest, slavery, was somehow the cause of the war. A very important point. And it wasn't just Abraham Lincoln saying, I knew that slavery is the reason the war happened. He's saying all knew. Southern slaveholders knew it. Northern Republicans knew it. Northern Republicans' opponents, Northern Democrats, knew it as well. And continue. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents, Confederacy, would rend, tear apart the Union, even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected the magnitude or the duration which has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with or even before the conflict itself should cease. So what is he saying there? Saying that because this war was fundamentally a war over slavery, each side knew it. What really happened is that the leaders of the Confederacy, from the very beginning of the war, by seceding from the United States, metaphorically signed slavery's death warrant from the very beginning of the war. They sought, the Confederacy, to strengthen, perpetuate, and extend slavery, while I only claimed that I was going to restrict its territorial expansion. While nobody expected this war to take on the magnitude and duration that it has, neither anticipated that slavery, the cause of the conflict, might cease with or even before the conflict itself should cease. Another way of saying that is that Abraham Lincoln, in a very subtle way, is saying that because the war was about slavery, because the cause of the war was slavery, the end of the war and the meaning of the war, from my perspective, is for slavery to be abolished. So he makes this very clear statement about his interpretation of why the Civil War happened and what he intended to do upon taking office for a second term. And if you're, by the way, curious about the date on this, March 4th, 1865, presidents, unlike today, were inaugurated in March of the year after the election, unlike now where it's January. So that explains the date. The date's also important because unfortunately for Abraham Lincoln, he only had 5.5 weeks left to live. He was infamously, or 5 weeks, I should say, to live. He was infamously, there we go, assassinated on April the 15th, 1865. If you don't know the story, he was shot in the head from behind by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. So the saddest part of the story from Abraham Lincoln's perspective is that Lincoln, who knew the war was fundamentally about slavery and meant for the war to lead to the final abolition of slavery, never actually lived to see slavery's final abolition. When he died, the Confederacy, under General Robert E. Lee, had surrendered 1 week before, on April the 8th, 1865. So Abraham Lincoln lived 1 week after the official surrender of the Confederacy, but he did not live to see slavery fully abolished. Had he lived, what were his plans? Well, thankfully, we know what his plans were with reference to abolishing slavery because he had been working on them up until the day that he died. Abraham Lincoln recognized the limitations of the Emancipation Proclamation. And he had decided, along with other Republicans, that the only way that they could be assured that the Civil War would end and slavery would completely be abolished along with the end of the war was in fact to pass a constitutional amendment forever abolishing slavery in the United States. And this amendment, the famous 13th Amendment, was passed, but not until 8 months after Abraham Lincoln's death in December of 1865. The 13th Amendment, just pull up the text, I should have done that already actually, a very short amendment which simply states, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, with one exception, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or in a place subject to their jurisdiction. So except for servitude as punishment for a crime, slavery was fully abolished. How was it done so? Through a constitutional amendment. And one might say the most important constitutional amendment in American history, certainly after the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. In my mind, the most important constitutional amendment. So I'll stop there, and then next class, or next week, I should say, I keep saying class as if we're going to be in class, week 14, April 27 and 29, we'll begin discussing the post-Civil War period, the legal and constitutional history of the so-called unfinished revolution, the period of Reconstruction. And so I'm asking you to read chapter 10 of Michael S. Benedict, Reconstruction in the Constitution, and then to read the Construction Amendments, the 14th, 15th amendments of the Constitution, 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments of the Constitution, although we just read the 13th Amendment. Okay, so I'll wrap it up there. As I said at the top, both next week and the week after are normal weeks. Catch up if you can on your reading responses, primary source responses, I should say. You should have access to your midterm grades. If you don't see it for some reason, or if something else has come up, please let me know via email. And otherwise, I will post a discussion response tomorrow, or a discussion prompt tomorrow, Thursday the 23rd, and you'll have until Sunday the 26th to complete it. And I'm going to sign off here. Continue to be well, everybody, and be in touch if you have any questions. Okay, bye.